I always claimed that I was born in a tomato can, and Mother opened the can and poured it out, and there I was. I was born into the business, and I've been in it ever since. I've got pure tomato juice running in my veins.
Just before the turn of the century, the Alexander Hirzel family emigrated from the little Swiss village of Diesbach. Among his children in the large family was Karl R. Hirzel, a teenager at the time. Karl's family settled in East Toledo, where he went to school and worked in the neighborhood. Karl's ambition was to become a brewmaster. After achieving that goal, he married Lena Schneider, also from Switzerland.
Our great-grandfather was a brewmaster of several breweries because they moved, what I always thought was interesting, they moved from U.S. to Canada for a bit and back. But then
Karl Hirzel, a Swiss immigrant, lost his job as a brewer during Prohibition and moved to northwestern Ohio to find opportunity. And in 1923, he began farming a 60-acre plot in what is now Northwood.
So if you look back at the history of the entire company, it started as a farm. On that farm there was actually orchards. There were vineyards on that. My great grandpa was not a farmer.
I do feel that Grandma, Lena, and Grandpa were like at their wits' end, like we have to do something.
Well, the first crop he had was cabbage, and he could only sell them for a nickel a head, and only then if he would give another one away. Then he had a bigger crop the second year, and then he made sauerkraut.
He went to the Fremont Kraut Company and learned how to make sauerkraut. It wasn't just something that came to him.
That was the kraut room upstairs, was where they're shredding. Grandpa would core the heads and put them in the shredder, and Grandma would sprinkle the salt on.
So you know how you see those pioneers, you have to see the woman in there, she's chopping the wood, she brings it in, makes a fire. I think that was Lena's role.
But then the grocer said, what we really need is a nice whole peeled tomato in a can. So they raised some tomatoes, peeled the tomatoes, put them in the cans.
The story is he had a little box with some cans in it, and he would just kind of leave it on the counter and, be talking to the grocery store owner, and the guy would say, hey, as he's leaving, hey, wait, you left your cans here. He'd say, oh, give those to your wife. She'll enjoy those. And the next time he'd come around, he'd be like, hey, you better get me some of those because my wife really liked those.
My father never graduated from high school because he had to stay out of school to run the canning machinery because nobody else could keep the contraption running.
My grandpa at that time was fairly mechanically oriented, so he did a lot of the actual mechanical work at the plant.
His aptitudes were in solving problems, and there was one problem after another to solve.
including using a potato harvester as a tomato harvester.
My father and mother got married in '35.
If he would not have had Rosalie standing by his side, you know, they might have just took another direction.
Mom was, you know, she really changed her whole life for him.
Yes.
Everywhere I can still look at stuff now and know that there were things that she supported, even if it was counter to the personal comfort of herself.
Mom had 3 children right off the bat. Carl was born in 1936, Joe 37, me in 38.
And then, lo and behold, World War II was declared. Well, that was the year that Bill was born. John was born in 1944.
And then me in 48.
They were forced to keep this place running. They had to keep making food. There was no discussion about it.
The military took 70 cases out of every 100 that we packed. That was a given. They would tell us how many cans we could have and how many we were capable of. So the other 30 cases went to our regular markets. So that meant you really had to pack a lot of stuff.
World War II was a major challenge from a personnel standpoint. Most of the able-bodied young men had gone off to war.
A lot of the labor came from the ladies, the housewives that lived in the neighborhood behind the Northwood plant. They were all the ladies that were pulling plants, and then they'd come in and peel tomatoes or sort tomatoes or work the lines, and a lot of them were just neighborhood people from back there.
One of the sources of labor were the German war prisoners. Camp Perry, which was out on Lake Erie, they would go every day and pick up the men, and they'd come and work.
During World War II and shortly after World War II, there was no such thing as California. They didn't have water. They couldn't grow anything. This was California.
It's my understanding, I think Dad said there was over 150 tomato canners in Ohio.
Most of the growth of the company took place during wartime, and a lot of reinvestment into the company. Whereas most of the other canners, they weren't. They were putting it in their pocket, not putting it into the company.
So sanitation and tile, the buildings were tile, and he was putting a boiler in, investing a lot of money that the competitors weren't doing.
Well, you can imagine after the war and the soldiers all came home that there was a tremendous volume, and the prices were terrible after World War. A lot of canners went out of business right then and there.
This is where the relationships with salespeople and people that, the salesmen at that time, no matter what they were selling, they were all over the countryside visiting different places and seeing things, and being able to get that guy sat down at a meal and talking. They'll share things that you never even thought you needed to know.
Heinz had a plant in Bowling Green, and they were receiving pickles then in the bulk. And they were unloading those pickles in a watertight, shallow flatbed trailer. We built these wagons so the back door could be opened up, the whole entire tailgate of the wagon.
Then Pa had this water, originally he had water hoses, so he's making us keep getting water hoses out there. 3/4 inch water hose, that's a long way from a 3-inch pipe, right?
They had a breakdown in the inside, or maybe it was lunchtime, I don't remember. Put the tailgate back in the thing, but forgot to shut the water off. Come back out. Oh my gosh, here's these tomatoes floating in the water. So we opened up the tailgate, and boy, the load came right out of the back.
He knew that then that was the principle of bulk handling. And I can remember the Campbell Soup guys coming and all these other guys from West Coast coming, looking at how we were unloading.
And Dad always said, and it's a saying that I'm sure you've heard, the difficult we do right away and the impossible takes a little bit longer.
But, Papa Hirzel always, I think he had visions of each one of us.
As we grew up and Carl got married and he was selling and he was running this plant. By 54, we bought the Pemberville plant, 1954. I moved down there.
The plant that we acquired in Pemberville, this one was masonry and 2 stories and had an installed boiler. And
Joe would be pounding and working and slaving away on that Peville plant. I was supposed to fix the office up. Well, the office was nothing but a building. I mean, it was hooked on, but it was nothing. And the only thing that was there was this great big old clock,
One thing I learned about the organization, just going through maintenance alone, is that this is the first company I've ever worked for. Not that I worked for a lot of companies, but they fabricate everything.
I think that was what made us, it was very innovative, Okay, we're going to make a case packer instead of going and buying one. He'd say, you guys could get this. I guess I was one of the very first people who's aseptic.
What makes aseptic processing unique is usually when you home can, you're putting a hot product or a cold product into a container and then heating that product up, and that's what makes it commercially sterile. In aseptic processing, you're actually heating the product ahead of time and cooling it, and how it's still sterile is that you take a sterile product which has been heated and you put it into a sterile container in a sterile environment.
If you've got a clean environment and you wash the fruit properly, you don't have to put as much heat history to it.
The Buckeye Brewery was closed, so he drug the tank over here and then told me to fill a large tank aseptically without any spoilage.
Those tanks were sterile and filled, and then we held the tank. And then during the winter, when we would reman, we'd open that tank back up. And of course, you've got this 30,000 gallons of tomato that you had to get used. It wasn't like, yeah, I'll use a couple boxes today.
My father and I went to auction sales of companies that tried it and they failed. They went broke. And we're buying equipment from those places. So you can learn, observe what they did, and maybe he did wrong.
It surprised me at that time that the canners or the food processors didn't have a good knowledge of microbiology. We knew that if you cooked it, you could kill it. Mrs. Wagner was our office lady, and then Marilyn took over that. She married Lou Cosma. Was
a blast to work for. And they both put in lots of hours. They were also very instrumental in getting the first computer between Mom and Aunt Marilyn, Uncle Lou. They learned that system and got the first computerized system up and running in the office.
2 name brands, Carl. Now, share that.
Well, the original brand that grandfather had is called Star Cross. He was a Swiss immigrant, so he had the cross from the Swiss flag and a star from the American flag. Our newer brand is Di Fratelli.
As we were going into the eastern markets, the eastern states, they were looking for an Italian-sounding name. That Star Cross just didn't match up with the Italian markets.
What is this Star Cross? He said, it may be good, but he says, my customers wouldn't touch this with a 10-foot pole. He said, it has to be Mamma Mia. It has to be Italian.
Carl told the employees, whoever comes up with a good label that we can use will receive a $500 cash award.
I think it was $50.
Elvira Berkey was an employee of in Northwood on the label line. Was an Italian-American. And
her brother was visiting.
Her dad was Italian.
She said, my ma says,
you guys are the brothers, why don't you call it De Fratelli? It's the brothers.
That really resonated with Dad and his brothers, so I don't know how Marilyn felt about that.
You know, it's not my choice.
They looked at it, they thought it was an import. Of course, they knew it wasn't. But they said, "Oh, this looks good." And they couldn't pronounce it. Nobody. It was hard to remember. It probably broke all the branding rules.
But I've asked other people, and they have various subtle, from the brothers, of the brothers.
Somebody corrected and said, it would have been DE, not DEI. DEI was God Brothers, And when you worked for my dad and his brother, sometimes you got that feeling as well.
If I'm understanding it right, it says you cannot copyright De Fratelli because of it being a common word, of the brothers. What we did was we trademarked the design of the De Fratelli logo. And what's incorporated into that is the star-cross symbol.
We just changed all the time, We ran green beans in Pemberville, and to have other products. And asparagus we had planted when Uncle Rudy was farm manager. We planted, I guess we had nearly 60 acres of asparagus.
Then Uncle John took over. And Uncle John was it was interesting because he actually started this Brinker farm mid-70s. And then like I said, the first time he actually implemented organics and using compost was in the late 70s. Everything right now that is the mantra of how to do things properly, farming, he was already looking at in the mid-70s.
And at one point, he said, you know, there's not much left to do on the farm. He said, but Pemberville tore all the floors out of the factory. And they're trying to put all the machinery back in. Why don't you go give them a hand? And 18 years later,
I was with my father almost every day when he'd come to work. My brother Otto and I were with him. And
we were going through high school years. We were building that plant up is going from 5,000 tons a year to 20,000 tons a year over the course of probably 5 years.
I spent a lot of time with Dad in the office, so I got to hear firsthand all of his phone conversations, all of his dealings with outside people. Salesmen would come in, and I early on worked with him on the purchasing side.
I distinctly remember my grandfather, because he was working at that time in the shop, and we clean up the shop at the end of the day, and I was sweeping the floor around. So he proceeded to show me how to sweep a floor the right way, and said that that job is just as important as any other job. And it seemed like there was always building or construction or equipment being built. There was always something like that going on out in the factory, and I spent, most of my time out here in Northwood.
But that was when they built the front end of the factory and redid that section. So all that construction, I saw that happen, and then we put up the greenhouses and put up the kraut room, and then we bought this place down here in Ottawa in early 80s, and I spent a good 15 years just becoming a demolition. Grandpa and brothers saw Ottawa as a good opportunity because it had good farmland. And
we spent 5 winters going down after tomato season, cutting out down the old sugar mill. And some days it was so cold you didn't get much done.
But the idea of buying that Ottawa plant was because he said, if you want to bring another generation in, they don't want to work underneath you guys.
We basically started out, I can remember when we first started, we had probably a 20-foot flume where we unloaded the tomatoes. And we were unloading wagons 10 ton at a time, or 9 ton at a time, probably even less than that with the Schulte wagons. But the growth has been immense.
So it wasn't until about the early mid-90s that we started to convert what would be the plant you see today start to take shape.
I was thinking, especially the older generation, like Joe and Bill and Carl, John and those guys, I think the company was their business and their hobby.
I worked closely with the third generation. It has changed a lot as they passed it on to the next generation. It'll be interesting how it goes from there to the next generation.
The fourth generation Hirzels that were here were, of course, Steve, who is our president, Carl Hirzel, who's the director of operations, Joe Hirzel II, who is plant manager in Pemberville. Jessica was supply chain manager at the time, but now she's plant manager here in Northwood. Otto Hirzel was plant manager here at the time, and now he's a special projects manager. Lou Cosma was at the farm as the farm manager. Heidi is doing IT. They have understood that with changing of the times and changing of the employee environment and so forth, that you have to be willing to make changes in order to keep your employees engaged and to keep the company growing.
When I first started working with them in the sales side of it, you would think that the retail and food service is almost 50-50. We found that there's other opportunities out there, particularly when it comes to the industrial side.
So the next big advancement was 300-gallon tote fillers. And that allowed us to put a little bit in a little bit smaller package, still very large, but you could load it onto trucks and you could deliver it to one of the other facilities, and then you could pull product out of that during the off season and make various sauces, salsa, you name it.
I think that was one of the really smart things they did early on, especially in the retail space, was differentiate themselves with some of the core products that we produce.
And I think that was driven into us pretty strongly, is like it takes all these years to build up that credibility. It doesn't take much to destroy it.
I believe it was Carl that used to say, you got to do what you do and do it well.
That's something that really has lasting value. And you know, when you talked about COVID earlier, and all the things that companies had to go through, and people, there were shortages. We didn't short anybody. We came through there, and that's who we are.
You know, some of the benefits of the model of the company, of fresh packing product, and we produce our crop, 90% of it is produced basically once a year.
We're actually the ones producing the ingredient because we work with a grower and getting the local crop, building those ingredients to components that we can use at a later date. So many different options and combinations that there really isn't about anything that we can't do when it comes to a red sauce.
Take a drive out I-90 West, and just before you hit Toledo, you'll find fields and fields of tomatoes.
This crop right here, this field looks phenomenal.
Harvested at just the right time.
Here in this area, we focus a lot on the local aspect. The fact that all of our tomatoes are sourced locally within the region.
It only takes about 6 to 10 hours to get a De Fratelli tomato from a local farm and into the final container.
We're still committed to fresh pack on the brand pretty much across the board. Or if we can't run it fresh pack, like our pasta sauces and you know, the new pizza sauce that we just came out with in the jar, we really try to promote that we're not adding water to the product. And if we have to thin it out a little bit, we try to use our own tomato juice to do that.
I'd say our average length is 30 to 40 miles. We try to harvest that within a few hours of time it's processed. That's where I'm working with Lynn. Several phone calls every day, making changes to the schedule of what we already did.
Ours actually has a true tomato taste. It's not the same as a California tomato or even the Italian tomato. It's that Midwest tomato flavor.
Of that grower base, 41% of that grower base is third generation. 45% is second generation, and we have one grower who's fourth generation.
As a family, I think our culture was, you can do, and Uncle Bill likes to say, Americans, we can do things. Well, I think that's the same way with this family and the culture and how we were brought up is, if I didn't hear figure it out 1,000 times, I'll eat my hat. I mean, it was just like, well, what do I do here? Well, go figure it out.
Carl would go out every day and visit with the employees, and he was visible. If they had a problem, they could go to him. And same with me. When I was there, if they had a problem, they would come to me, which was, I appreciated.
It means a lot because since I've been here, you know, I've helped my family.
With the job that I got, the opportunity that they give me to, you know, to keep working in here, you know, and I like it.
It's like coming to work with your family every day. And even if you're not actually a family member.
They trust that you do your job, and they give you that trust. They make you feel that you can do your job.
I've always been amazed at how well we've been able to work together. And believe me, it's not all roses all the time. But there were never grudges. Never grudges held. Yep, we'll have disagreements. And that's human nature.
I say this a lot, and maybe I write it a lot when I'm sharing comments with employees, but especially our team, our management team, I think we're in a very noble profession. You can say, you look at all the things you can do in life and what you can do and how do you add back to society and to your fellow man. And it's quite noble to be able to take a crop that's coming out of the field, preserve it, and then build sustenance, build food products that people really enjoy, but also sustenance for people that just need food in their stomachs. And I think that's something to take a lot of pride in, because I remember Dad saying, you aren't going to make a killing in this business, but you should be able to make a living if you do it right. And I think, you know, overall this group and this family has done it right for now 100 years.
Within 300 miles of this location, because that includes Chicago to the west and all of Ohio and Indiana, Michigan, western New York, with some going beyond to Florida and Virginia, but the majority of it within a relatively close distance.
Story of the Hirzel family in the tomato growing and processing business here in northern Ohio, and my guests have been Joe and Carl Hirzel. Hope you'll stay with us.